The Hound of the Baskervilles. Chapter 2. The Curse of the Baskervilles. "I have in my pocket a manuscript," Dr. James Mortimer declared, his voice tinged with a sense of urgency. "I observed it as you entered the room," Holmes replied, his gaze sharp and discerning. "It is an old manuscript," Dr. Mortimer confirmed. "Early 18th century, unless it is a forgery," Holmes stated, his tone matter-of-fact. "How can you say that, sir?" Dr. Mortimer questioned, his voice laced with a touch of surprise. "You have presented an inch or two of it to my examination throughout our conversation," Holmes explained calmly. "Even a novice could estimate the date of a document within a decade or so. You may possibly have read my modest work on the subject. I'd place it around 1730. The exact date is 1742, Dr. Mortimer declared, producing the manuscript from his breast pocket. "This family paper was entrusted to my care by Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden and tragic death some 3 months ago created quite a stir in Devonshire. I should mention that I was both his personal friend and his medical attendant. He was a man of strong will, sir, shrewd, practical, and as devoid of imagination as myself. Yet he took this document very seriously, and his mind was prepared for precisely the end that ultimately befell him." Holmes extended his hand for the manuscript, gently flattening it upon his knee. "You'll observe, Watson, the alternating use of the longs and the shorts. It's one of several indicators that allowed me to pinpoint the date." I peered over his shoulder at the yellowed paper and the faded script. At the top was written Baskerville Hall, and below, in large, sprawling figures, 1742. "It appears to be a statement of some sort," I remarked. "Yes, it's a statement of a certain legend that runs in the Baskerville family," Dr. Mortimer confirmed. "But I understand that you seek my counsel on a more modern, practical matter?" Holmes inquired, his tone shifting slightly. "Most modern. An utterly practical, pressing matter that must be resolved within 24 hours. However, the manuscript is brief and intimately connected to the affair. With your permission, I shall read it to you." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips meeting, and closed his eyes with an air of resignation. Dr. Mortimer turned the manuscript towards the light, and, in a high, cracking voice, read the following curious old-world narrative. "Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles, there have been many accounts, but as I descend directly from Hugo Baskerville, and as I received the story from my father, who in turn heard it from his, I have written it down with the utmost conviction that it happened precisely as I recount it here. And I urge you, my sons, to believe that the same justice which punishes sin may also most graciously forgive it, and that no curse is so heavy but that, through prayer and repentance, it may be lifted. Learn then from this story not to fear the consequences of the past, but rather to be circumspect in the future, that those foul passions which have so grievously afflicted our family may not be unleashed once more to our destruction. Know then that during the time of the Great Rebellion, the history of which by the learned Lord Clarendon I most earnestly recommend to your attention, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name. It cannot be denied that he was a most wild, profane, and godless man. This, in truth, his neighbors might have forgiven, seeing that saints have never thrived in those parts, but there was in him a certain wanton and cruel disposition which made his name a byword throughout the West. It happened that this Hugo came to love, if indeed so dark a passion may be known under so bright a name, the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate. But the young maiden, being discreet and of good repute, would always avoid him, for she feared his evil reputation. So it came to pass that one Michaelmas, this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, descended upon the farm and carried off the maiden, her father and brothers being away, as he well knew. Once they had brought her to the hall, the maiden was placed in an upper chamber, while Hugo and his friends sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Now, the poor lass upstairs was on the verge of losing her wits at the singing and shouting and terrible oaths that came up to her from below, for they say that the words used by Hugo Baskerville when he was in his cups were such as might blast the man who uttered them. At last, in the grip of her fear, she did that which might have daunted the bravest or most active man, for by the aid of the ivy growth that covered, and still covers, the south wall, she climbed down from under the eaves and made her way home across the moor, there being 3 leagues between the hall and her father's farm. It happened that some time later, Hugo left his guests to carry food and drink, with other worse things perchance, to his captive, and so found the cage empty, and the bird escaped. Then, as it would seem, he became as one possessed by a devil, for, rushing down the stairs into the dining hall, he sprang upon the great table, flagons and trenchers flying before him, and he cried aloud before all the company that he would that very night surrender his body and soul to the powers of evil if he might but overtake the wench. And while the revellers stood aghast at the fury of the man, one more wicked, or, it may be, more drunken than the rest, cried out that they should put the hounds upon her, whereupon Hugo ran from the house, crying to his grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack, and giving the hounds a kerchief of the maid's, he set them on the trail, and so off full cry in the moonlight over the moor. Now, for some time, the revellers stood gaping, unable to comprehend all that had been done with such haste. But soon their bemused wits awoke to the nature of the deed that was about to be done upon the moorlands. Everything was now in an uproar, some calling for their pistols, some for their horses, and some for another flask of wine. But at length some sense came back to their crazed minds, and the whole of them, 13 in number, mounted their horses and started in pursuit. The moon shone clear above them, and they rode swiftly abreast, taking that course which the maid must needs have taken if she were to reach her own home. They had gone a mile or 2 when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands, and they called out to him to know if he had seen the hunt. And the man, as the story goes, was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak, but at last he said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds upon her track. "But I have seen more than that," said he, "for Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels." So the drunken squires cursed the shepherd and rode onward. But soon their skins turned cold, for there came a galloping across the moor, and the black mare, dabbled with white froth, went past with trailing bridle and empty saddle. Then the revellers rode close together, for a great fear was upon them, but they still followed over the moor, though each, had he been alone, would have been right glad to have turned his horse's head. Riding slowly in this fashion, they came at last upon the hounds. These, though known for their valor and their breed, were whimpering in a cluster at the head of a deep dip, or goyal as we call it, upon the moor, some slinking away and some, with starting hackles and staring eyes, gazing down the narrow valley before them. The company had come to a halt, more sober men, as you may guess, than when they started. The most of them would by no means advance, but 3 of them, the boldest, or it may be the most drunken, rode forward down the goyal. Now it opened into a broad space in which stood 2 of those great stones, still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the center lay the unhappy maid where she had fallen, dead of fear and of fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, Nor yet was it that of the body of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised the hair upon the heads of these three daredevil roisterers, but it was that, standing over Hugo and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that ever mortal eye has rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, the three shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming, across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen, and the other twain were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the Hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down, it is because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which is but hinted at and guessed. Nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. Yet may we shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not forever punish the innocent beyond that third or fourth generation which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that Providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and I counsel you by way of caution to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. This from Hugo Baskerville to his sons Roger and John, with instructions that they say nothing thereof to their sister Elizabeth. When Dr. Mortimer had finished reading this singular narrative, he pushed his spectacles up on his forehead and stared across at Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The latter yawned and tossed the end of his cigarette into the fire. "Well," he said, his voice laced with a hint of boredom. "Do you not find it interesting?" Dr. Mortimer inquired, his tone hopeful. "To a collector of fairy tales," Holmes replied, his expression a mixture of amusement and disinterest. Dr. Mortimer drew a folded newspaper out of his pocket. "Now, Mr. Holmes, we will give you something a little more recent. This is the Devon County Chronicle of May 14th of this year. It is a short account of the facts elicited at the death of Sir Charles Baskerville, which occurred a few days before that date." My friend leaned a little forward, his expression becoming more intent. Our visitor readjusted his glasses and began. "The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville, whose name has been mentioned as the probable Liberal candidate for Mid-Devon at the next election, has cast a gloom over the county. Though Sir Charles had resided at Baskerville Hall for a comparatively short period, his amiability of character and extreme generosity had won the affection and respect of all who had been brought into contact with him. In these days of nouveaux riches, it is refreshing to find a case where the scion of an old county family which has fallen upon evil days is able to make his own fortune and to bring it back with him to restore the fallen grandeur of his line. Sir Charles, as is well known, made large sums of money in South African speculation. More wise than those who go on until the wheel turns against them, he realized his gains and returned to England with them. It is only 2 years since he took up his residence at Baskerville Hall, and it is common talk how large were those schemes of reconstruction and improvement which have been interrupted by his death. Being himself childless, it was his openly expressed desire that the whole countryside should, within his own lifetime, profit by his good fortune, and many will have personal reasons for bewailing his untimely end. His generous donations to local and county charities have been frequently chronicled in these columns. The circumstances connected with the death of Sir Charles cannot be said to have been entirely cleared up by the inquest, but at least enough has been done to dispose of those rumors to which local superstition has given rise. There is no reason whatever to suspect foul play, or to imagine that death could be from any but natural causes. Sir Charles was a widower, and a man who may be said to have been in some ways of an eccentric habit of mind. In spite of his considerable wealth, he was simple in his personal tastes, and his indoor servants at Baskerville Hall consisted of a married couple named Barrymore, the husband acting as butler and the wife as housekeeper. Their evidence, corroborated by that of several friends, tends to show that Sir Charles's health has for some time been impaired, and points especially to some affection of the heart, manifesting itself in changes of color, breathlessness, and acute attacks of nervous depression. Dr. James Mortimer, the friend and medical attendant of the deceased, has given evidence to the same effect. The facts of the case are simple. Sir Charles Baskerville was in the habit every night before going to bed of walking down the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall. The evidence of the Barrymores shows that this had been his custom. On the 4th of May, Sir Charles had declared his intention of starting next day for London and had ordered Barrymore to prepare his luggage. That night, he went out as usual for his nocturnal walk, in the course of which he was in the habit of smoking a cigar. He never returned. At 12 o'clock, Barrymore, finding the hall door still open, became alarmed and, lighting a lantern, went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and Sir Charles's footmarks were easily traced down the alley. Halfway down this walk, there is a gate which leads out onto the moor. There were indications that Sir Charles had stood for some little time here. He then proceeded down the alley, and it was at the far end of it that his body was discovered. One fact which has not been explained is the statement of Barrymore that his master's footprints altered their character from the time that he passed the moor gate, and that he appeared from thence onward to have been walking upon his toes. One Murphy, a gypsy horse dealer, was on the moor at no great distance at the time, but he appears by his own confession to have been the worse for drink. He declares that he heard cries, but is unable to state from what direction they came. No signs of violence were to be discovered upon Sir Charles's person, and though the doctor's evidence pointed to an almost incredible facial distortion, so great that Dr. Mortimer refused at first to believe that it was indeed his friend and patient who lay before him, it was explained that that is a symptom which is not unusual in cases of dyspnea and death from cardiac exhaustion. This explanation was borne out by the post-mortem examination, which showed long-standing organic disease, and the coroner's jury returned a verdict in accordance with the medical evidence. It is well that this is so, for it is obviously of the utmost importance that Sir Charles's heir should settle at the Hall and continue the good work which has been so sadly interrupted. Had the prosaic finding of the coroner not finally put an end to the romantic stories which have been whispered in connection with the affair, it might have been difficult to find a tenant for Baskerville Hall. It is understood that the next of kin is Mr. Henry Baskerville, if he be still alive, the son of Sir Charles Baskerville's younger brother. The young man, when last heard of, was in America, and inquiries are being instituted with a view to informing him of his good fortune. Dr. Mortimer neatly refolded the newspaper article and tucked it back into his pocket. Those are the publicly known facts, Mr. Holmes, surrounding the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. I must express my gratitude, Sherlock Holmes replied, for bringing this case to my attention. It certainly possesses intriguing aspects. I had noted some newspaper reports at the time, but I was deeply engrossed in that Vatican cameos affair, and, in my eagerness to assist the Pope, I lost track of several compelling English cases. You say this article contains all the publicly available information? It does, Dr. Mortimer confirmed. Then enlighten me with the private details. Holmes leaned back, his fingertips delicately touching, his expression unreadable, a mask of detached objectivity. In doing so, Dr. Mortimer began, his voice trembling slightly, I reveal that which I have confided to no one. My reluctance to share this information with the coroner's inquiry stemmed from a scientist's aversion to publicly endorsing popular superstition. I also reasoned that Baskerville Hall, as the article states, would likely remain vacant if its already rather eerie reputation were further tarnished. For these reasons, I deemed it justifiable to divulge less than I knew, as no practical benefit could be derived from it. However, with you, Mr. Holmes, there is no reason for me to withhold the truth. The moor is sparsely populated, and those who reside near each other form close bonds. Dr. Mortimer continued. This proximity led to frequent interactions with Sir Charles Baskerville. Aside from Mr. Frankland of Laughter Hall and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist, there were no other educated men for miles. Sir Charles was a recluse, but his illness brought us together, and our shared interest in science fostered our bond. He had amassed a wealth of scientific knowledge from South Africa, and many an evening we spent discussing the comparative anatomy of the Bushman and the Hottentot. Over the past few months, it became increasingly evident to me that Sir Charles's nervous system was on the verge of collapse. He had taken to heart the legend I just shared with you, to the point that, while he would walk within his own grounds, nothing could persuade him to venture onto the moor at night. As incredible as it may seem to you, Mr. Holmes, he genuinely believed that a dreadful fate loomed over his family, and certainly the historical accounts he provided of his ancestors were not reassuring. The specter of a ghastly presence constantly haunted him, and on several occasions he inquired whether I had ever encountered any strange creatures or heard the baying of a hound during my nocturnal medical journeys. He repeated this question several times, each time with a voice quivering with excitement. I vividly recall driving to his house one evening, roughly 3 weeks before the fatal event. He happened to be at his front door. I had disembarked from my gig and was standing before him when I noticed his eyes fix upon something over my shoulder, staring past me with an expression of utter terror. I spun around just in time to catch a glimpse of what I took to be a large black calf passing at the head of the drive. So distraught and alarmed was he that I felt compelled to investigate the spot where the animal had been. However, it was gone, and the incident seemed to have a profound impact on his mind. I stayed with him that evening, and it was during that time, to explain his earlier emotional outburst, that he confided in me the narrative I read to you upon my arrival. I mention this seemingly minor episode because it takes on some significance in light of the subsequent tragedy, though I was convinced at the time that it was entirely trivial and his agitation unwarranted. It was upon my advice that Sir Charles decided to seek medical attention in London. I knew his heart was compromised, and the constant anxiety he endured, however unfounded its cause, was undeniably taking a toll on his health. I believed that a few months in the bustling city would restore him. Mr. Stapleton, a mutual friend deeply concerned about his health, agreed. Then, at the last moment, this terrible catastrophe struck. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore, the butler who discovered the body, sent Perkins, the groom, on horseback to me. As I was up late working, I managed to reach Baskerville Hall within an hour of the incident. I confirmed and verified all the details reported at the inquest. I traced the footsteps down the yew alley, observed the spot at the moor gate where he seemed to have waited, noted the change in the shape of the prints beyond that point, confirmed that there were no other footprints aside from Barrymore's on the soft gravel, and finally meticulously examined the body, which had not been touched until my arrival. Sir Charles lay face down, his arms extended, his fingers digging into the ground, his features contorted in a powerful emotional struggle to the extent that I could barely recognize him. There was absolutely no sign of physical injury. However, Barrymore made one false statement at the inquest. He claimed there were no traces on the ground around the body. He didn't notice anything, but I did, some distance away, fresh and clear. "Footprints?" Holmes inquired sharply. "Footprints," Dr. Mortimer confirmed, his voice hushed. "A man's or a woman's?" Dr. Mortimer stared at them with an unsettling gaze, his voice almost a whisper, as he answered, "Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound." The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.